We should note that each outcome from the collapse of Syria is detrimental to both Russia and the US. There are three reasons why Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war to save the Assad regime since 2015. First, Russia wanted to maintain a partner state. Syria is one of the very few Middle Eastern countries friendly to Russia after the US overthrew the regimes of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. All these events in these three countries occurred under the guise of the Color Revolution, or the so-called Arab Spring, with manipulation by the elites following socialist ideologies, and all happened during the Obama administration. Second, saving Syria also helped strengthen Russia's international influence, with Russia wanting to maintain its only naval and air bases in the Mediterranean. Third, Russia had a deep concern that a victory for the extremist Islamic factions would turn Syria into a terrorist base against Russia and its allies in Central Asia. The presence of many fighters from Chechnya and other Muslim regions of Russia in the Islamic forces in Syria and Iraq amplified this fear. With the collapse of the Assad regime, Russia's hope of maintaining a partner state also collapsed. In the future, the Kremlin will have to deal with the threat of extremist Islamic terrorism. Like Israel, the Russians cannot trust the factions led by HTS in rebuilding the Syrian state without funding international terrorism. Therefore, Russia's naval base in Tartus and airbase near Latakia are unlikely to remain secure. The Russian fleet stationed in Tartus is said to have left the port, with their warships now offshore, away from Syria. This status is likely temporary, pending clarification of Russia's relationship with the new government. The Russian airbase is reported to be surrounded by HTS, but has not yet been attacked. As we reported in yesterday's video, although Russia and HTS have agreed, it may be only temporary. Considering the highly complex and unstable nature of relations with all of Syria's neighboring countries, especially with Israel currently conducting airstrikes and ground attacks, the new government in Damascus may allow Russia to retain its bases to balance the military scale with Israel. However, the presence of Russian military bases in Syria is closely tied to the complex ethnic issue. The locations of Russia's bases along the Mediterranean coast are home to the Christian and Alawite minority groups of Syria. President Assad comes from the Alawite branch of Shia Islam, and during his 50 years of control over Syria, his government has favored this ethnic group. Alawite militias have played an essential role in suppressing Sunni Muslim opposition forces. Although HTS leader al-Jolani has promised not to take revenge on the Alawites and stated that the minority group will be respected and not subjected to strict Sunni Sharia law, even with such a commitment, those who follow him and other allied factions may not adhere to it. Under pressure from Israeli attacks, HTS may want to reassure the Alawite and Christian communities by allowing Russia to keep its bases. However, Sunni insurgent groups may view Russia's bases as potential support for a future Shia uprising. In a scenario where HTS does not allow Russia to keep its bases, and if the Kremlin does not want to leave, it would require Moscow to deploy warships, aircraft, and a large number of ground forces. Given the current war in Ukraine, it is unlikely that Russia has enough resources to do so. Furthermore, the rapid collapse of the Assad government, supported by Russia in Syria, has mirrored the swift 11-day collapse of President Ashraf Ghani's US-backed government in Afghanistan. The way the Syrian army disintegrated before the insurgent forces led by HTS made it difficult for Russia to continue the fight in Syria. Therefore, it is likely that Russia will withdraw from Syria, as Mr. Trump recently stated. On the US side, they also face many difficulties in Syria. The question is whether the US will try to maintain its bases in Syria. Trump's team has repeatedly stated its desire to stay out of the Syrian conflict. So, if the US withdraws from Syria, the biggest issue the US needs to consider is the fate of the Syrian Kurds it has supported. In the Syrian civil war, with significant help from the US and the semi-autonomous Kurdish state in northern Iraq, the Syrian Kurdish forces, known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, have occupied a vast area in northeastern Syria, The US also has bases in this region. HTS's victory over the Assad government's military essentially had support from Turkey, although the country has always denied it. It is important to note that the HTS attack came from areas controlled by Turkey in northern Syria, and it would have been difficult to carry out without Ankara's support. The successful use of drones by HTS indirectly suggests Turkish assistance. Turkey has two core interests in Syria. As we analyzed in a previous video, the first interest is that President Erdogan wants the 3 million Syrian refugees who fled the civil war in 2011 to Turkey to be forced to return to their homeland. If the new government in Syria can establish peace, it will undoubtedly receive international aid, which presents an excellent opportunity for Erdogan. Currently, hundreds of refugees are reported to be lining up to return to Syria from Turkey. Turkey's second interest is to reduce the power and territory of the Syrian Kurds, a force they accuse of being allied with the Kurdish terrorist group PKK in Turkey. It is worth noting that at the time of HTS's attack on Assad's army, the Syrian National Army, backed by Turkey, with support from Turkish air forces, launched an assault against the Syrian Kurds in the town of Manbij. This created a paradoxical situation where Kurds backed by Turkey attacked the Kurdish forces supported by the US. Suppose Turkey pressures the new Syrian government to attack Kurdish-controlled areas in northeastern Syria. In that case, this will create a dilemma for the US, similar to the situation Russia is facing in the West. Will Trump abandon his Kurdish allies, or, to save face, will the US continue supporting the Kurds and risk sparking a crisis with Turkey? In reality, the Middle East is like a game of billiards, where the movement of one ball can cause others to move in different directions and bounce off each other. The difference is that, unlike billiards, with the ethnic complexities in Syria, no one can predict which direction the country will take, and no external players can fully control the outcome. Syria will become a battleground torn apart by both internal and external forces. Only one country is standing on the sidelines, observing the chaos, and taking a highly pragmatic and cunning approach: China, which imports a significant amount of energy from the Middle East. Although Syria is not a major oil producer, producing only 40,000 barrels a day compared to over 600,000 barrels daily in the early 2000s, its strategic location bordering major oil-producing countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia increases geopolitical risks for the energy market. Oil prices slightly increased after President Bashar al-Assad was overthrown. Meanwhile, China has gained control of a significant portion of Syria's oil and gas sector. Syria also lies in a critical geopolitical position, linking West and Central Asia to the Middle East and Africa, making it an essential part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is expected to yield substantial benefits. The challenge for Beijing is to compete for influence with both Russia and Iran, as both countries support and back Assad's regime. Both Russia and Iran have borne the burden of years of Western economic sanctions, while simultaneously putting efforts into fighting terrorism alongside the Syrian army and incurring security costs to maintain a military presence in Syria. In contrast, China simply seeks to maximize its economic interests from the crisis in Syria. Beijing adopts a sit-back and watches the tiger fight strategy, profiting from the situation without ever planning to send troops, similar to its approach in 2015, when it waited for Russia to defeat ISIS in Syria. China has now entered Syria as a major investor, seeking to control oil and other resources. China remains passive politically at this stage, aiming to coordinate steps with all sides, including Russia and the US. Once a new, stable government is established in Syria, China will step in as a reconstruction partner, claiming to be a key player in rebuilding the country.